Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti all'Istituto Italiano di Cultura. Good evening, everybody. The lecture of tonight, organized by Centro Primo Levi and the Italian Cultural Institute, launched Primo Levi at 100, a series of events on the occasion of 100 years from Primo Levi's birth that will take place at various venues in town, including the New York Public Library and Casa, Italiana, Zerilli, Marimò. And I want to remember you then next week, on 12th of March, we will have at the New York Public Library June, okay. A complete reading of If This Is a Man by Primo Levi. And I have to tell you that from my point of view, because I'm going to leave the Institute at the beginning of July, this occasion is very important also, because if I could say something very personal, because when I arrived here, one of the first initiatives I organized was a complete reading of the Inferno of Dante. And so to finish my work here with a complete reading, in a certain way, of another Inferno by Primo Levi, it's very important for me. The lecture of tonight is a speech of Pankaj Mishra on the drowned and saved. But before the lecture, on the occasion of the opening of the Primo Levi at 100, the Centro Primo Levi and the Italian Cultural Institute will present a special edition of the Center Award to Robert Weil and Ann Goldstein for their dedication and vision in bringing to light the English edition of Primo Levi's complete works in 2015. So I invite Alessandro CASSIN of Centro Primo Levi to present the event.
Good evening and welcome. Buonasera. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. It is no coincidence that this award ceremony takes place at the Italian Cultural Institute. Giorgio Van Straten and the Institute, for the past 4 years, have been the unwavering partners of many of our initiatives on Primo Levi and beyond. So thank you, Giorgio. Over 21 years of existence, Centro Primo Levi has periodically felt the urge to confer a prize, the Center Award, to individuals who have provided outstanding contributions in the promotion of a work and legacy of Primo Levi. On Levi Centennial, it is my distinct pleasure to confer the award jointly to Robert Weil and Ann Goldstein, respectively the publisher and the translator-editor of Primo Levi's complete works, published by W.W. Norton's Live Right imprint. Weil and Goldstein, it is a particular pleasure to give a prize to a publisher and a translator, often the unsung heroes behind grand publishing projects such as this. 15 years in the making, a 3-volume set totaling 3,000 pages of newly translated novels, poems, essays, and interviews. The complete works will provide the base for reading, scholarships, and research for years to come. To give you a scale of this exceptional achievement, Primo Levi is the only Italian 20th century author whose work has been translated completely in one edition into English. We are greatly indebted to the visionary determination of Bob and Ann on this project. Unfortunately, Ann Goldstein could not be with us tonight as she is in Italy. So allow me a few words about Bob. If anyone thinks that publishing as we know it is suffocating under technological changes or corporate dominance, a quick look at Bob's career will convince you that under the right circumstances, it is alive and well, and continues to carry on an essential cultural function. Currently, editor-in-chief and publishing director at W. Norton Liveright, Bob, over the years, has published books that have received every major American award, multiple National Book Awards, Pulitzer Prizes, MacArthur Fellowships. The list of authors, both American and international, whose rights he has acquired is much too long to read. I will instead try to bring your attention to a few formidable publishing achievements of his. We owe Bob Weil the complete works of Isaac Babel from 2002, the 2014 Henry Roth Mercy of a Rude Stream, the complete novels, the 2018 new translation of the complete prose of Giorgio Bassani, known as the Novel of Ferrara. It is really an outstanding new translation. And more recently, Nelson Mandela's Letters from Prison, 1962 to 1990, which made Mandela an international emblem of courage and perseverance. A first volume came out in 2018, and a further 2-volume set, I believe, is about to come out in July. There are often profound reasons for a publisher to select an author, and vice versa. The wide horizons of Bob's cultural interest, his refined literary taste, publishing acumen, and sheer passion for books qualifies him as an ideal posthumous American publisher for Primo Levi. Thank you, Bob. We will display the one for Anne as well.
It's heavy. Well, awards of this sort rightly belong to writers and translators, especially those translators who are unsung heroes of literature, and rarely, if ever, go to book editors. So I'm both surprised and I'm deeply humbled that the Centro Primo Levi, with NATALIA INDRIMI and ALESSANDRO CASSIN acting as board of director members in collaboration with Giorgio von Straten as the director of the Italian Cultural Institute, decided that a book editor merited such a distinguished and meaningful award. I'm saddened that my co-author, Anne Goldstein, who's really remarkable, who edited the complete works of Primo Levi, is in Rome and not able to join us. But she too thanks Alessandra, Natalio, and Giorgio, and likewise feel it's a great honor to receive this prize. She adds in an email I received this morning that she's especially grateful that the complete works have enabled and will enable others to know this great writer, but for her, the real honor was being able to spend the time with Levi, to be engaged with the innumerable facets of his mind as a chemist and a writer, deeply attentive to power of words and what they can and cannot do. That's from me. It's ironic this evening that Pankaj Mishra has chosen The Drowned and the Saved on which to base his lecture, because this is the very work that drew me to Levi in late 1987, just as this book was posthumously being published in the US. It was not only Levi's language. Like the chickadee he sings in winter, his throat has ice in it, is the way New York Times critic Richard Eder once described the sad musicality of Levi's words. But for me, his philosophical structure and his understanding of the human universe, most apparent to me in the psychological insights that seem to flood almost every page of The Drowned and the Saved. It was as if Levi had stripped humankind of its pleasantry and lacquer, of all its claims to a humanity that may never really have existed, and that here was a reconceptualization of a base human power structure that finally made sense to me, more so than in any works of even Freud, Rousseau, or Nietzsche. If I can get these pages separated. So imbued with the mission to want to publish anything new by Levi, I approached in 1988 Levi's then American agent, Bobby Siegel, who had previously sold 6 of Levi's books to Simon & Schuster in a shopping bag that she carried to their corporate office. Sadly, Siegel told me that nothing remained of new of Levi's to publish, but each year or so, I would always check in, call Bobby Siegel in New Jersey, asking her if by any chance had any new Levi work miraculously manifested itself. Alas, the answer was always no. Even arriving at W.W. Norton in December 1998, my editorial desire remained. After having published a completely new translation, as Alessandro says, of the complete works of Isaac Babel in 2001, I belatedly learned that Levi's publisher Einaudi had published the opera, the Levi Complete Works, in Italian in 1997, and not realizing, thank God I didn't realize the endless challenges, the literary bogeys and eddies that awaited us all, not realizing that we would end up translating 14 Levi books in 2,912 pages, I convinced my Norton colleagues that we must do this project. It was my immense fortune a few years later to be introduced to Ann Goldstein by Henry Finder of The New Yorker. She was still there then, and there were many times, many years, when we thought it might never get done. In fact, it would take 15 years from conception to publication to bring the complete works into English. But to borrow from Levi's own words, the 3-volume publication finally did appear, quote, like a meteorite, a heavenly object, a work loaded with symbols that became, in the chemist's own hands, and I quote, an immense living force. I think those words are actually when a Christmas package arrives in Auschwitz from his mother and sister, but that's my recollection. So this honor today then enables us to once again, recognize this immense living force that was Primo Levi, who through his literature brought so much light to our eyes. Again, Ann and I thank you all.
Good evening. I have first a practical request to please shut down every mobile device, telephone, and other electronic items that you might have. I'm delighted to be here tonight to inaugurate this year-long series of programs that mark the 100th anniversary of Primo Levi's birth. I'm especially pleased to share this with my colleague Alessandro CASSIN, co-director of the center, and Giorgio Van Straten, with whom we have built bridges and faced challenges for 4 years, and whom I hope will remain our partner in the future. In preparing this event, we asked how we could contribute to the conversation on Levi's work at a time when so many of his concerns confront us with new urgency. The pervasive acceptance of violence, growing hierarchies of human worth emerging from systems of oppression, privilege, and protection. The cult of identity, a weapon of defense and offense by which, I quote Levi, a person is not a person, but the group to which he or she belongs, quote. The power of science and technology to destabilize and perhaps destroy the planet in which we live. Primo Levi was born in 1919, the same year in which the fascist movement was created and first emerged in public in the city of Milan. Levi described growing up and becoming a man under fascism as in a world without windows, organized in inflexible categories in which so little knowledge was available, and the only escape were ancient classics, family tales, and eventually science. In the camp, as a rarefied experimental laboratory, Levi saw something unimaginable and unprecedented, but at the same time, something that deeply belonged to the European society and its relation to men and women, to that word that had made it possible. It is telling that today we increasingly look at Auschwitz as something that happened and needs to be looked at closely in all its gruesome details, like a spectacular exhibition or a film, as if it had fallen from the sky and had no relation to anything else, as if it could be put off by an "how did it happen?" or a "never again." Instead, Primo Levi's description of Auschwitz never indulged in its spectacle, but rather made it a pointer toward the entire world around it, a world that seemed normal, acceptable, and even good. In the past few years, I began to encounter Pankaj Mishra's articles in the many publications to which he contributes. One of the first aspects of his work that caught my attention is that he could write about the troubling state of society across the globe, always trying to find a depolarizing angle, deploying a richness of knowledge that can only come from a curious mind, genuinely interested in the other. In the climate of extremism that dominates most of what we read, I was struck by his precision, empathy, and humility, quality that Levi valued as a way of life. There was more, not just an affinity, but what seemed to be a dialogue with Levi's writing, a continuity. I thought that Mishra's critique of the cultural homogeneity in which the present word has sunk resonated with Levi's description of how power needs to impose a sameness to perpetuate itself, and how the fanatic obsession with difference stems from it. As I kept reading Pankaj Mishra's books, from The Ruins of the Empire and The Age of Anger, I found a way of thinking both refreshingly original and extremely familiar, one that does not speak out of a cause or a will to battle, but out of the desire to understand and share. My colleague Alessandro CASSIN, who had read other of his books, sent me his introduction to the classic Sanskrit epic Ramayana. Mishra's considerations reminded me, with all due differences, a little bit of Levi's description of the Piemontese Jewish custom of his ancestors and their language, the one that is in Aragon in the periodic table. It was clear that for both, an origin, an accident of birth, was something beautiful and valuable to begin a conversation and not to segregate oneself or others. And this is how we came to this evening, to make room for new conversations, starting, not by chance, by Primo Levi's last book, and a new encounter that I like to think as an imaginary birthday present to Primo Levi. And I would like to thank Pankaj Mishra for traveling all the way from London for this event. It means a lot to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you all for coming to this event. I feel particularly grateful to Natalia for inviting me because it gave me, first of all, a very good reason to revisit some of Primo Levi's work, and also to be reminded of his great importance to me in a lot of writing and thinking that I've done, but also to be freshly reminded of the relevance he has, and Natalia mentioned it, and so did Bob, to the tormented world we live in today, where the question of political evil that Levi grappled with presses down on our souls and minds again. I read him systematically as a young man in the late 1980s. I was very fortunate actually to be introduced to him relatively early in his career in the English-speaking world. But I really read him in a real sense after my own very small brush with political evil. And this happened when I went to the valley of Kashmir in 1999, 20 years ago, to report on the counterinsurgency there. I don't think I'm simplifying a very complex issue to say that the local population of Kashmir absolutely despised what they saw as an occupying force, the Indian army, the Indian government, the Indian bureaucracy. By a large majority, overwhelmingly, I'd say, they regarded India as a cruel occupying force in Kashmir. And by that time already, the insurgency was little more than a decade old. Tens of thousands of people had been killed, numerous, countless, many tortured, mutilated, gang raped. There were local legends about places where unspeakable forms of torture were inflicted on young Kashmiris. A whole generation had grown up dreading these particular physical acts that became widely known because the victims came out and spoke about them to others. At the same time, the people who were inflicting these tortures, this unspeakable violence, had the most eloquent reasons for why they were acting in these brutal ways. They were doing it, they said very clearly, for the sake of the Indian nation, for keeping India united, for preserving India's integrity. And not only the people who were doing this back in Delhi, back in India, when these articles were published, I was shocked by just how callously the facts of massacre, torture, gang rape were received by journalists, by people who should have been actually, in a way, acting against the perpetrators. But these facts, these horrible facts, were again ignored for the sake of these larger abstractions. And over the years, I mean, this is a very long story. The speed with which Muslims in general became the enemy within, the stranger, despite the fact that Muslims have been in India for over 1,000 years, all this, stemming from this brutal insurgency in Kashmir, all of this really came as a huge shock to me. It was a kind of revelation. And I tell you why it was a revelation, why I was so naive to receive this as a revelation, because we had grown up, and I speak of my generation in India, with the thought that virtue was on our side. And again, I should explain that as a post-colonial country whose national narrative, whose main mythology consisted of depicting itself as a victim of imperialism, a victim of imperialism that had finally, heroically overcome the imperialists, won independence, and had then embarked upon a great noble experiment in secularism, in pluralism, in democracy, in even socialism. I had grown up in that India which prided itself, and we were told to feel pride in these achievements of independence and also this experiment we had embarked upon. So with that kind of upbringing, to be confronted with the facts of the Indian occupation in Kashmir was to be really exposed to a completely different reality altogether. It was to realize that a supposedly secular, morally superior, democratic Indian republic could itself be a cruel imperialist regime. Of course, since then, in the last 20 years, many, many more things have become harder to take. India has elected a suspected mass murderer to high office, not once, but twice. In these circumstances, to go back to Primo Levi's work, especially the last book that I'm going to talk about, you really left in no doubt about the inherent capacity of human beings to hate and to commit the most grotesque atrocities on those they hate. And Levi, in some sense, is very alert to this. And I'm going to quote from. Actually going to quote him a lot because he's best savored through his own luminous prose. And this is from the preface to If This Is a Man, where he says, many people, many nations can find themselves believing, more or less consciously, that every stranger is an enemy. For the most part, this conviction lies buried in the mind like some latent infection. It betrays itself only in random, disconnected acts and is not the basis of a system of thought. But when this happens, when the unspoken dogma becomes the major premise in a syllogism, then at the end of the chain stands the lager. It's the product of a conception of the world carried to its logical consequences with rigorous consistency. As long as the conception exists, the consequences remain to threaten us. The story of the death camps should be understood by everyone as a sinister signal of danger. So, not something completely unique or spectacle, as Natalia put it, but something that can happen again. He was also remarkably clear, and this is again something that only comes to me on this recent reading, about the origins of racism, not in the most obviously noxious ideologies like Nazism, but in some of the most progressive worldviews of the modern age. Here is another quotation. The 19th and 20th centuries were the great centuries of Europe, the centuries when the great philosophical systems were built, when the awareness of intolerance and the advocacy of tolerance originated. In spite of all this, there has been, precisely within Enlightenment and later positivist thought, a continuous effort to justify, to find a rational motive for racism. This instinct that is anything but rational. It is fascinating today to read books by scientists of absolute good faith, respectable, and to this day, respected people. And he goes on to talk about how they made racism look scientific and rational. But I want to really talk more about the drowned and the saved. In many ways, the author's death, a few months after the book was published, makes it seem like his final statement. It seems like he meant it. I may be wrong about this, I'm speculating. He meant it as a kind of commentary on his writings as a whole. There's an interview among the many new things I discovered in the complete works, interview in 1979, where he speaks of this book project that he has in mind. And what he wants to explore, he wants to reject the most simplistic interpretation. That is, he puts it, on one side, the pure oppressor, without doubts, without hesitations, and on the other side, the victim sanctified by his role as a victim. It's not like that. The human machine, the human animal is more complicated. There are intermediate stages. Those who have been called torturers were not torturers in a pure state. They were men like us who took on the role of torturers for some reason. I intend to explain these reasons in a future book. There are many disturbing revelations, especially now when you read The Drowned and the Saved. But one of them, one of the most striking one, is that the memory of former victimhood, whether at the hands of Nazis or other European imperialists, does not prevent one from becoming a brutal perpetrator. And that remembrance is not enough. Everything Levi has written to the point of Drowned and the Saved bears witness to a monstrous crime. But Drowned in the Saved is the work of a man who bears witness, of course, but also questions the value of bearing witness, who is very skeptical about our capacity to draw correct lessons from the past. To go back to India, there's probably no country, no major country at least, where the memory of imperialism and its many victims is so carefully nurtured, is so carefully maintained. In fact, this year we had the 100th anniversary of a massacre in Amritsar, which was, without irony, commemorated, without comment, that the atrocities or the repressive laws that the Indians who were massacred had gathered to protest have been exceeded many, many times in their brutality, in their arbitrariness, by the laws successive Indian governments have introduced in independent India. But nevertheless, imperialism remains this work of the devil that still allows many people in India to feel uniquely virtuous. There's no country in the world where the memory of genocide is as routinely commemorated as in Israel. But again, who can really argue that Israel's policies today are unimpeachable when it comes to the rights of the Palestinians? I want to linger here a bit on Primo Levi's own position on Israel. He went there in 68, I think. And he wrote an essay, which I hadn't read previously, in support, in very strong support of a country that he saw correctly as besieged. At that point, and some of you might recall this, in large parts of Asia and Africa, Israel was seen as an anachronistic incarnation of racist colonialism. Many people in these countries in Asia and Africa were completely untouched by European guilt over the Holocaust. They really saw Israel as another white colonialist venture backed by the United States, other European imperialist powers, and brutally dispossessing the local population, the Arab population of Palestine. It's to actually Primo Levi's credit, when I read this essay, that he's actually aware of this criticism coming from the so-called Third World. So he says in the piece, yes, Israel is an ally of the United States. It is a pawn of imperialism. This is embarrassing, and not everyone likes it. Not in Israel and not here in Italy. In fact, the alliance is liked less and less as the prestige of the United States diminishes. Then he goes on. Is this alliance determining and constraining? His answer is, I don't think so. The Israeli constitution seems to me solidly constructed on a socialist and democratic base, and the interest of the government is directed towards internal matters much more than toward power politics, which after all is natural for a small country. This today might seem like a naive vision of course, many Israelis themselves, some of the most intelligent writers and critics after 67, saw great dangers in the country's messianic post-war mood. They saw very clearly that this could be, these easy victories, these easy conquests could be the harbinger of a deeply self-harming, self-destructive military occupation. But understandably, many people outside of Israel, many people in the Jewish diaspora, found themselves in reflexive solidarity with Israel. And I think my sense is that Levi, with his socialist commitments, was among the many people on the left at that time in Europe who thought that Israel was building a socialist society. In fact, many writers, politicians in Europe at that time were deeply anti-Semitic in respect to the Arabs. It might be hard to believe, especially today as Britain's Labour Party struggles with allegations of institutional anti-Semitism. But British leftist liberals in the 50s and 60s revered Israeli leaders such as David Ben-Gurion, while almost entirely ignoring the plight of the Palestinians. It's interesting that in the early 80s, Levi notices, in the case of Israel, how things have changed, how dramatically things have changed. A lot of people came to this realization only very recently, in the last 20 years. And of course, the big shift in his perspective is brought about by the invasion of Lebanon, the massacres and the refugee camps there, facilitated by the Israeli military. And he speaks out, and he's still being attacked for that today. And he says, Israel, less and less the Holy Land, more and more the military state, is starting to act like the other countries of the Middle East with their radicalism, their distrust of negotiation. Of course, he says, the attack on Lebanon was not unprovoked. But the violence with which, he writes, the attack was carried out frightened the world. I'm not ashamed to admit my own wrenching sorrow. I have a bond with this country and in a certain sense feel it as a second homeland. I would like it to be different from all other countries. And for that very reason, I feel distress and shame for this undertaking. I feel indignant towards those who hastily compare the Israeli generals with the Nazi generals. And yet, I have to admit that Begin, the Prime Minister then, draws such judgments on himself. I fear that this undertaking, with its frightening cost in lives, will inflict on Judaism a degradation difficult to cure and will damage its image. I sense in myself, not without surprise, a profound emotional link with Israel, but not with this Israel. He says in another context, we must choke off the impulses towards emotional solidarity with Israel to reason coldly on the mistakes of Israel's current ruling class. What are the deeper meanings of these shifts of perspective? And I feel the clues are there in The Drowned and the Saved. All through the book, he is constantly challenging our simple division of the world into victims and heroes. Take, for instance, the very famous second chapter entitled The Grey Zone. The term, as you would know, he invented to designate those who could not be simply categorized as guards or inmates. I think it's important to clarify that he is very tough with those who carelessly conflate the victim and the executioner. he quotes the filmmaker Liliana Cavani. We are all victims of murderers and we accept these roles voluntarily. There was an echo of this in the recent Indian elections, where a prominent right-wing academic said that the assassin of Mahatma Gandhi lives inside us as well. This was in response to a Hindu fanatic who claimed that the man who killed Mahatma Gandhi is a great patriot. She is now a member of parliament. Now, Primo Levi is very clear about this. As he put it, I don't know if a murderer lurks in my bowls, but I do know that I have been a guiltless victim, not a murderer. And I know that murderers have existed, and that to confuse them with their victims is a moral disease, an aesthetic affectation, or the sinister sign of complicity. Yet such is Levi's fine awareness that he won't just content himself with defining the legal and moral responsibility of murderers. He wants to examine how we all belong to the gray zone, and that the break between victims and perpetrators is not as clear-cut as it seems. And it seems to me this is where his uniqueness lies. Because we are actually we have lived through, but this moment is quite extraordinary because it's marked by an epidemic of victimhood. One group after another, even the most privileged ones, claim to be victims of some great calamity or other. It's imperialism, war, ethnic cleansing, torture, economic inequality, racial discrimination. What almost all of these self-professed victims claim are some unique moral privileges for themselves and the groups they are representing. Either in the process of overcoming a great evil, I've spoken about India and the relationship with imperialism, or making a claim that they are passive victims. Of course, there are some people who transcend all these different roles, these limited outlooks, and turn upon their compatriots for being uniquely depraved, corrupt, sinful. But in almost all cases, this moralizing discourse presents the victims as a true guardian of virtue, people who have precisely identified evil as something outside of us. I feel Primo Levi's uniqueness lies in rejecting this easy role. He doesn't shout like a moralist, he doesn't accuse, he doesn't really moralize. Confronted with the greatest, the most extraordinary instance of inhumanity, he remains human. And what he's really trying to show that there is no likely moral benefit to be had from examining the past if it leads people to assume these simple roles of heroes or victims. What he wants to do, and it's an astonishing move for a pure victim like him, a guiltless victim like him, is to boldly, unsparingly examine his own reactions in the face of evil. Many of you would be familiar with the story of Rumkowski that he describes in The Drowned and the Saved, a man who becomes intoxicated with this power entrusted in him by the Nazis and starts to behave ridiculously like a king, which is just absolutely grotesque given the conditions that he finds himself in the ghetto. And Levi is eloquent where he describes the workings of power power as something like a drug, and I'm quoting from him directly. The need for one and the other is a mystery to anyone who has never tried them. But after the initiation, addiction kicks in, along with the need for higher and higher doses. And so does a rejection of reality and a return to childhood dreams of omnipotence. If it is true that Rumkowski was intoxicated by power, we have to admit that the intoxication was not because of, but rather in spite of the ghetto environment. In other words, the intoxication was so powerful that it prevailed even in conditions that would seem to extinguish individual will. In fact, the syndrome of prolonged and uncontested power was clearly visible in him, as it was in his most famous models: the distorted vision of the world, the dogmatic arrogance, the need for adulation, the convulsive clinging to the levers of command, and the contempt for law. He describes this, and then just a few pages later, in The Drowned and the Saved, he recounts an episode from his own experience, which is actually not in his first book, The Experience of the Camps, where he's feeling very thirsty one day, and he finds a little bit of water and shares it with his closest friend, careful to exclude anyone else. What a small, insignificant act of egotism it is. And yet, it plunges Levi into suspicion, as he puts it, the suspicion that each man is his brother's Cain, that each of us has usurped his neighbor's place and lived in his stead. So, with this particular episode, with the grey zone, with the story about Rumkowski, Levi, I think, is exploring not radical evil of the kind we've been told numerous times the Holocaust represents, but the banal, everyday evil that leads us to prefer oneself to others. I think he becomes very aware, and it comes through in this book most clearly, that there is this ordinary evil which, can have relatively benign consequences for the most part. But in conditions of war, totalitarianism can have devastating consequences. And the chapter on the Germans, the German responses to his books in The Drowned and the Saved, clarifies this further. Because what it shows that, Levi's is, as you say, let there be no mistake that everyone, to a greater or lesser extent, was responsible for the Holocaust, but also that this responsibility encompasses the overwhelming majority of the German people. So there were few individuals who were directly culpable for the radical evil of Nazi crimes. But what made it possible also was the passivity, the ordinary evil of ordinary Germans. Few exceptions, of course, but on the whole, they willfully ignored the blatant persecution of Jews for as long as they could, and then failed to do anything about it. The themes he returns to in this book, he used to talk a lot to young people, visit schools. And he says, young people ask us more frequently, more insistently, what cloth our torturers were made of. By torturers, they mean our former guardians, the SS. And in my opinion, the term is inappropriate. It implies deformed individuals, born bad, sadistic, flawed at birth. Instead, they were made from the same cloth as us, average human beings, of average intelligence and average malice. So again and again, he sort of returns to this question in The Drowned and the Saved. What is the nature of evil? I think the first book speaks of a particular evil, a radical evil of the Holocaust. But Drowned and the Saved offers a more disturbing vision of an insidious evil that cannot really be expunged by remembrance. One reason for this, of course, is that 40 years have passed since the first book. Levi has lived through many calamities, not comparable to the Holocaust, but nevertheless extreme atrocities, the carpet bombing of German cities. He's lived through the rampant use of torture in Algeria, sometimes by the victims of Nazism, by the French victims of Nazism. He has lived through the destruction of Vietnam by the United States. He has lived through the genocide in Cambodia. He's aware of these unbearable historical ironies, and towards the end of Drowned and the Saved, he talks about how the exodus of brains, the direct quote, from Germany and Italy gave birth to the nuclear bomb. The desperate Jewish survivors fleeing Europe after the great shipwreck create in the heart of the Arab world an island of Western civilization and a pretext for renewed hatred. Then the silent Nazi diaspora taught the arts of persecution and torture to soldiers and politicians in a dozen countries bordering the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. Many new tyrants keep a copy of Mein Kampf in their drawer. It could still come in handy, maybe for some adjustments or the substitution of some names. But I'd say, one of the events that also meant to him more than these other events was Israel's own transformation from a virtuous socialist democracy into a colonialist power. And armed with this particular bitter experience, he is convinced towards the end of the book that it happened once, again a direct quote from him, and it can happen again. This is the heart of what we have to say. It can happen anywhere. I do not mean, nor can I say that it will happen. As I've just noted, it's unlikely that all the factors that triggered the Nazi madness could occur again and simultaneously, but some precursory signs are appearing. Violence, useful or useless, is before our eyes. It's spreading through sporadic private incidents and government lawlessness. And some of the things he says are truly eerie when you read them today, as various performers, various actors, political actors, sometimes literally actors, emerge in countries around the world, Pied Pipering populations, manipulating them. It's extraordinary to read some of these sentences from Primo Levi, where he says, all that is needed is a new two-bit actor to mobilize the violence, legalize it, declare that it is necessary and just, and infect the world with it. Few countries can be guaranteed immunity from a future wave of violence generated by intolerance, lust for power, economic claims, religious or political fanaticism, or racial friction. We thus need to sharpen our senses and distrust the prophets, the charismatics, the persons who speak and write fancy words without the backing of sound reasons. I feel the lesson from Drowned and the Saved, this final document of Primo Levi, can only be a despairing one. It describes an irredeemable world condemned to repeat the monstrous error of her ancestors. And yet, the book is encouraging and comforting in an extraordinary way. What it reveals, above all, is an extraordinary human being, a victim of the worst evil human beings have inflicted on their own, and yet the man who chooses to confront that evil with utmost, some might say, near fatal lucidity, with the most carefully chosen words, without strident accusation or recriminations. I think it was Bob or Natalia who mentioned his gentleness. A man who refuses both false comfort to others and ego satisfaction for himself. Hope for us today, reading Levi, comes not from the world he lived in, of course not, or the one that we inhabit, one that he could so clearly anticipate. It comes from Primo Levi himself. The possibility that such a miracle like him existed and perhaps will exist again. Thank you.
We will take some questions now if anybody have questions or comments.
I can stand actually.
Yes, I do have a question. And clearly what Primo Levi describes in The Drowned and the Saved is a hopeless word, and I think you have expressed it very well. It's not just about, he looks at these pieces that have to do with power and with and with human beings. However, there is, I think, an underlying element, and is the economic system in which this happens. And it doesn't speak of it directly, but I think he indicates clearly that that's what is the base. And I think actually in his first book, in the description of the dealings of the camp, he describes what is an economic system, and is what expands to other places, and somehow involves societies that did not necessarily have that structure. And I think that the way you started from the situation today in India is very telling that way. And I wonder if you've thought a little bit about this aspect of his critique of society.
Well, one wishes that he had written more explicitly about this aspect, but you're absolutely right. What comes through even in his depiction of how power works and how human relations are corrupted by this necessity almost to exercise domination over the other, to secure one's advantages at expense to the other, to rejoice in other people's misfortune. All these tendencies that have always existed, obviously, but a system, and especially not in an economic system in a kind of very monstrous form in the camp, that unleashes those tendencies, those instincts, institutionalizes them, is obviously going to turn all of us into monsters. So there is a specific component to his critique, a critique of a political system, an economic system that sets us spiritually and existentially at each other's throats. That is a very powerful aspect of his writing. In fact, there's a book about a slum in Bombay, Beyond the Beautiful Flowers, which I'm sure some of you have read, by Catherine Boo. I reviewed that book in the New York Times, and I actually began with Primo Levi in quoting the Grey Zone, and this description of the camp and the way power works through the hierarchies of the slum. Eerie sort of similarities between what Levi describes in the camp and what goes on in a slum in neoliberal Bombay, in neoliberal Mumbai today. Again, you know, what you were saying, this sort of this tendency to make people ferociously compete with each other, and to think that their salvation lies in dominating, degrading the other. I think that's absolutely right, that there is.
Do you see something today in this global society that would help people, lead people out of that mechanism?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, it's not accidental. It's not just a mere quirk of history that someone like him was dedicated to certain socialist principles. Because in its secular form, of course, socialism, right from the time it emerges in the 19th century as a response to the savagery of capitalism, preserved some of the most important ethical teachings of traditional religions, philosophies, most importantly Christianity. And it was felt to be absolutely essential, because without that we were condemned to living in a jungle, in a kind of Darwinian nightmare. And I think it's not at all surprising that young people today are attracted to it after their experience of this state of savagery, after their experience of this kind of gradual, steady dispossession. So I think, you know, if there is any kind of political hope today, it's this realization that we really cannot go on like this, you know, embracing these predatory forms of political economy, destroying the environment in our urge to consume, to acquire, that we need some fresh thinking about these issues. And that, you know, can only really come about by exploring, by institutionalizing in our private and public lives some of these other completely neglected notions of collective welfare, of a society which doesn't consist of competing individuals, a society which has not been made over in the image of a marketplace. So that is, you know, that to me seems to be one source of hope today.
Appreciated your observations. I happen to be a documentary filmmaker, and I've been stalking Primo Levi for maybe 15 years, because when I heard a talk on Jerzy Kosinski, who, along with Paul Celan and Primo Levi, committed suicide after surviving the Auschwitz. My cousin, who also is a documentary filmmaker, did the Warsaw Ghetto with the BBC. And in your blurb, I found something I'd been looking for. And I'll quote you that. So it has always been, so will it always be. And maybe they committed suicide because they realized that things would always be as it has always been, and that they couldn't make a difference. They couldn't change the future. And your talk of the relevance and the resonance of that brought that home to me. I wonder what you think about that.
I think, I mean, first of all, I must say there is some doubt about whether Primo Levi committed suicide. I don't know what the official version is. It cannot be known, obviously. We just cannot be certain about this. But it is clear that he was suffering before he died and had been suffering for a while. And that the revelations or the insights in the drowned and the saved are of a despairing nature. But at the same time, I think there's still some lessons to be had from that book. I mean, by which I mean something that we can actually put in practice. That so much of our private emotions and public energies go into commemorating past atrocities and repeating to ourselves over and over again, never again, never again, never again. But really, I think what they often amount to is a kind of posturing, really. It's a kind of posturing, is claiming a kind of moral high ground, not really understanding the lessons of that particular past in the clear way that Levi understood them. Something that we have to be constantly on guard against, particularly within our own group. The group that claims to be victims or claims to have emerged from an experience of victimhood. That is the thing to be on guard against. Moral, spiritual complacency, the sense of moral superiority, which of course can come from an extreme experience of victimhood. I think it's exemplary in the way he rejected that. It's astonishing. I mean, I can't think of a figure like him in that respect. That he insisted on examining that particular experience without the slightest desire to claim any kind of moral high ground. So I think that is something, for us who spend, as I say, so much time, so much energy looking back at the past and essentially deriving a lesson from it that is favorable to us. Let us be more unsparing with ourselves. Let us be more pitiless with ourselves. I think that is probably a good lesson to take from Primo Levi.
Superb, very thoughtful meditations. Thank you, Pankaj. There's a scene in Don Quixote where a 15-year-old boy who's being very cheeky is punished and told that you'll be thrown into jail overnight, sleep it off. And this 15-year-old replies, you can throw me in jail, but you can't force me to sleep. And there's a similar incident that Levi describes in If This Were a Man, where just in order to have some individual agency, some sense of self, after several, even 2 days of being starved, when given a piece of bread, they would refuse to eat it and save it and give it around to others, because at least he had agency over who decides whether he eats or not. And these are the small acts of individual heroism and individual beauty that are so powerful in all of his writing. I'd like you to comment on some of those and their effects on how we face the evils around us today.
Well, I mean, you put it better than I possibly could. But yes, I mean, the sense of individual agency, the fact that we have a choice even in the most extreme circumstances, under the most brutal, inhuman pressure, human beings are still capable of making choices, and that their sense of themselves, their identity, and likewise goes also true for the perpetrators. It's in constant interaction with others, with other people, with other world, that you're constantly reshaping the world with your actions. That is that again, I mean, that is something extremely powerful in Levi. That again, we are not talking about passive victimhood here. We are talking about a very active, fully responsible, incredibly self-aware sense of individuality, that is intensely aware of the people around one, and the small acts of selflessness and indeed selfishness that are mediating these relationships with the world, with the people around one. That again, I mean, that is something really unparalleled, and again, something that makes him so incredibly unique.
Thank you, first of all. As an Italian and as a human being, I consider Primo Levi and his words like a sort of scar which throbs and leaks, but it leaks light, So I struggle with it and with his words, and I don't deny that. My question is, in his writings, like, I don't know, essays or articles, has he ever mentioned the future ahead, because that would be very useful for us. I read I Sommersi e Salvati many years ago, and I cannot really remember it, properly, So I ask you this, and I thank you.
I mentioned some of that in my talk. I mean, I think he has a sense of foreboding, really, when he talks about the future. That the atrocities, the extremities that he's lived through can probably return, not quite in the same form, but in some other guise, and become equally murderous, oppressive for large numbers of people. And it is because of our moral inattentiveness. It is because of our spiritual complacency. In the end, he is really concerned with these individual flaws, individual defects, of finding the sources of many, many problems, the larger problems in individual conduct, in the failure to assume responsibility, in the failure to act when you confront evil. And I think when he looks around, obviously 40 years post the Holocaust, and lives through those historical events, it's easy for him to conclude that we have not really, we can tell ourselves never again, but, because of the way in which we conduct our relations with other people, partly in the way the economic system is structured, that these horrors that the world lived through in the early 20th century can return, not again, in the same form, but in some other way. And, that is what we are experiencing, what we are living through today. Fascism in its classical form will not return. It cannot return. We don't have mass parties like those. We don't have mass mobilization of that kind. The state is not strong enough to mobilize people in that way, or to militarize in that way, except in some countries. But we are experiencing a rapid degeneration of public life, of political life, which can lead to, very quickly lead to calamity.
Thank you, Pankaj. That was so insightful. And as a fellow Indian, I feel your pain. My question is that you just began actually answering my question in a way, is that what we face today is not classical fascism, and perhaps it will not be classical fascism. Uh, but there are tendencies from fascism which we see in India, and not so much in the US, but in India for sure. And the militarization, the 200 arms deals that Modi made in the last 5 years, the mass mobilization, the spectacle, the economic context of high unemployment, all of that, and the lynchings and the creation of the other in terms of Islamophobia is much more acute in India than here. Um, in Primo Levi, there is the diagnosis of the problem. But again, as my fellow Italian asked, where do you see are the grains of the solution? Because there's a crippling of the opposition. And without a political machinery, how do you take on something like this? Because agency is not enough.
No, in the context of India.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing is sort of the way in which history works. Of course, it repeats itself as a tragic farce, but also in the way India is set on this particular trajectory where it seems like it has to go through this horrible history all over again, that a political organization explicitly inspired by the Italian fascists and the Germans should come to power after 100 years of planning for that moment, and should seek to essentially create a one-party state, create a kind of homogenized society with, particular minorities, marginalized, stigmatized. I mean, again, what we've seen in other countries, and especially in Europe in the from the late 19th century onwards, sort of repeating itself. And at the same time, because we've come through an experience of post-colonial developmentalism, there are simply no political ideological resources in the country at this point to combat this juggernaut, to stand in front of it. It's like a totally clear field for them. The left has been systematically delegitimated, destroyed, which, let's not forget, that was also the case in Germany and in Italy. So it feels like that India will now have to go through this tragic cycle before we start to rebuild and kind of pick up the pieces, really. And so I feel very despairing, to be honest. I feel anyone who has any kind of historical awareness feels a great sense of despair, because we've seen this film before and it ends badly. It can only end badly. And so whatever, hopes we might have can really only be animated after the destruction, after the tragic destruction.
Thank you very much for the thoughts that you have shared with us this afternoon. And so much of what you have said is true. History does repeat itself again and again in different ways. Now, as a civilized society today, how can we face ourselves and live in a country where children are separated from their parents, and in some cases will never again be reunited with their parents because they don't know who belonged to whom? There is a certain amount of desensitizing going on right now, right here.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, the quotation from Primo Levi that I began with, that, there's a sort of chilling consistency to these acts and they become normalized. And at the end of that process is the concentration camp. Of course, not in the same way, but we are looking at internment camps. And I think, again, it's the failure to act, is the failure to vigorously resist that process, which makes it, in a way, normal that we go on with our daily lives. And again, I mean, what really, in the end, can you and I do about it, except write? As a writer, that's the only thing I can do. Maybe protest when the occasion demands that. But you suddenly realize, how really powerless we are in our so-called democracies. That they can elect these monsters who can exercise completely arbitrary, despotic power, and we have no control over that. So we've elected these people, but it's up to them to choose what kind of power they want to exercise, and it turns out to be, in the case of both India and the United States, a sort of cruel, despotic power, which does not hesitate to commit the most unspeakable acts, such as separating children from their mothers. All, again, in all sort of sanctioned, all justified with reference to some great noble abstraction, national unity, economic growth, all kinds of justifications are offered to rationalize these brutal acts.
I just wanted to ask you, Primo Levi suffered a lot during the Holocaust, and then finally the Jews have a state. So how do you explain him criticizing Israel or comparing treatment of the land or something to the actions of cruelty and what's happening in the Nazis in the world? How do you explain that?
How do I explain?
His criticism of Israel with the treatment of the Palestinians.
Right. Well, I think, the sense many people had, not just him, and one reason Israel had so many supporters back in the 50s and 60s, was that it had offered refuge to so many people fleeing these monstrous crimes in Europe. And, quite apart from that fact, Israel was a noble experiment. It was trying to create a society upon the principles of egalitarianism. So it commanded a kind of respect, solidarity back in those days. And Levi was one of those people who felt emotionally and politically and intellectually bound to it. Perhaps with the naive notion that many people had at that time, that having suffered the most monstrous crime humanity has ever inflicted on itself, they would have learned the lessons from it, the survivors, the refugees, to behave nobly towards the people that they were going to either live with, or even if they had displaced or supplanted those people, that they were going to enter some kind of negotiation with them. When did that did not happen, and instead Israel became a kind of occupying power, many of those people, including Primo Levi, started to think again about this project to which they had given, their complete allegiance. So it was a very kind of, in a way, it was reckoning with this notion that just because you're a victim doesn't make your actions completely virtuous. That you still have to go back to the earlier question, still have to exercise moral responsibility. There is something called individual agency. You can't just explain everything by reference to what happened in the years early 1930s to 1945. You can't just say that everything we do is self-defense. And so I think, he was one of the many self-aware, self-critical people to essentially reevaluate their support for Israel and to arrive at this very uncomfortable conclusion that they could not keep on supporting it as reflexively as they had, and that they need to step back and withdraw their solidarity from the Israeli government.
We will continue after. Thank you very much, Pankaj. Thank you very much. Thank you all of you for being here.